dark last week because we were in the delivery room last Tuesday. But yes, have a beautiful baby boy, Simon Harris. I was just telling David he had a bris bright and early this morning and is sleeping it off at the moment.
That's a good thing.
But everybody's happy, and we're pretending to be well rested.
Yeah, Sam and Dev are having a girl in December. We're super excited.
That's right, Mazel Tov.
Super excited.
Mazel Tov. Oh, Anne, what did you say? Yes, I do, Anne. We have a new baby boy. He's all of a week old.
See, I'm not the only one who doesn't read her temple emails.
Right? Well,
I read them.
in all fairness, I frequently don't read them either. But, we do the best we can.
Rabbi, you sent a notice out about that?
Yeah, it was like, we send those out for all sorts, when people die and babies are born and people get married, those sharing our lives sort of email, congratulations.
I don't think, I get a lot of emails from the temple, but I don't think I'm on that list. So,
well, I will inquire on your behalf.
Well, I didn't want to miss that kind of news anyway. Wow.
Right. I will inquire on your behalf.
That's okay.
All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started because I know we're going to have a robust conversation here this morning, but thank you all for, no pressure, David. Thank you all for joining us, and welcome to folks that are watching us on Facebook Live as well. A couple of words about the Torah portion before we launch into our conversation today, because sometimes it's kind of an eerie thing. It's as if our ancestors sort of knew exactly what would be going on, or a conversation that we'd be having when they selected this schedule of Torah readings for the year. Because this week we find our ancestors, still wandering through the desert, and everything seems to be going along pretty well, swimmingly, when one guy, Korach, decides to sort of rock the boat, and he rebels. He gets angry and frustrated, and he resents the fact that Moses is in charge and he's not. And he comes up to Moses and he challenges him with a kind of powerful and profound question. He says to Moses, look, Moses, all the community, all these people are holy, everybody here, and God is with us. So why do you get to raise yourself above all of us and be in charge, right? In other words, Moses, what makes you so special? And Korach's challenge, which he's ultimately punished for, questions the very nature of democracy, I think, right? This idea that if everybody's created equal, then why should any one person have authority over anybody else, right? Why should some people have access to status or money or power in ways that other people don't? And Judaism teaches, right, that each and every person has intrinsic worth and that every human being has equal value. But that does not mean that we are all the same. To be equal in worth does not mean that we all have the same God-given abilities. And Korach's mistake, I think, was that he confused the two. He confused equal worth with equal ability. He confused equal worth with equal ability. The fact that we believe that every human being has equal value, and at the same time acknowledge that every human being may not have equal ability or equal access, is why people like our guest today and the work that he's dedicated his professional life to matter so much. His name has been invoked a couple of times in our conversations these past, going on 4 months now. And some of you may remember, if you were with us on a very early episode, I told a story about one of the first conversations I ever had with David, in which he was trying to explain to me why pro bono legal work matters and what the utility, for lack of a better word, was for it. And he said to me, Beau, you don't really get it, because you don't need a lawyer in order to be able to go see the doctor. Or you don't need a lawyer in order to be able to get the banker to open a checking account for you. Or you don't need a lawyer in order to get a mortgage or to be able to rent an apartment. But many people don't have that same equal access, equal ability that you have, and need lawyers to ensure that the system of equality that is supposed to exist functions in the way that it ought to. And that's a recognition that while we all have equal worth as human beings, the world is often an incredibly unequal place. And so I'm thrilled to have David with us today for, like I said, what I already know will be a wonderful and thought-provoking conversation. No pressure. So I'll sort of let him introduce himself by means of my first question, but just say that I'll say that I think from my perspective, as it comes to lawyers, you have the coolest job in the world because you get to, one, as your friend and mine, Skip Kessler, likes to say, use your powers for good. And two, you get to sort of wrangle the resources of an incredibly large multinational law firm for good. Not to say that all the work that that your employer does isn't for good. But David, welcome. As I said that, I realized we're recording this. So David, welcome.
Thank you.
So kind of by way of introduction, maybe, and as I just sort of alluded to, you're not, in many cases, I think what at least I did before I met you, or a lot of folks think of when they think of a, hotshot Century City downtown lawyer at a big law firm. So can you kind of give us the Google Earth view of like, what do you do all day?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and thank you for listening to my rants all those years ago and retaining them. I'm pretty flattered. So thank you. So what do I do? Well, I work at O'Melveny & Myers, which is maybe the oldest, largest law firm with its roots in Los Angeles. It was started in the 1880s. And today we have, I don't know, 700 or 750 lawyers and all around the world. And I run the pro bono program. So my full-time job is to come up with projects and cases and enlist our lawyers to work on things that only lawyers can do to help the public interest. So that's my job. What I really do is I revel in how lucky I am to have what I think is the best job in our law firm, or in really any law firm in the city. Prior to coming to O'Melveny & Myers, I was the CEO at Bates Eddick Legal Services, where during those years, I felt like I had the best law job, period, in the city. And to this day, I still believe that's the best job anybody in the city can have, is to be able to run Bates Eddick. So now, instead of the best law job in the city, I have the best law firm job in the city. But please don't tell anybody that I think it's that good. I don't want anybody to know that and to try to steal my thunder. So what I do is I work with the legal aid community, which I used to be a part of, and I help put projects together. I put cases together. I talk to our lawyers about what they're interested in doing, what they're passionate about, what drives them. I talk to and work with all the legal aid organizations about what it is they need from the pro bono legal community to serve their clients. And together with their resources and with the awesome resources of O'Melveny & Myers, we use the law to combat poverty. And we do things that nobody else can do to combat poverty. As you said, that I said years ago, you and I are lucky. We don't need to have a lawyer to see a doctor, but many people who are poor do. And the best way to make democracy work for the people that need it most, oftentimes, sadly, is through the judicial system. It's the most responsive branch of our democracy. It's probably the most responsive way government can work anywhere on the globe throughout history, because if you are in a courtroom or you have a legal dispute, the government in the person of a judge has to listen to you and has to do something. You may not like what the judge does, but the government has to respond. And the only way to make that incredibly responsive aspect of democracy work is to have a lawyer. If you don't, it doesn't work for you. And so the results of having a lawyer can really be life-changing, life-altering, sometimes even life-saving for people who are poor and need this kind of assistance. So, you know, we do all different kinds of things. We do bread and butter, day-to-day necessities of life, making sure people can access a lawyer, making sure that they're not unjustly evicted, making sure that they're not going to be homeless, making sure that military veterans get their VA benefits, making sure people get their disability benefits, making sure that housing is safe and habitable, things that really go to the basic necessities of life. We also do larger things. We get involved at the forefront of not just combating poverty, but advancing our democracy, giving a voice to issues and causes that need to be addressed. Over the past few years, we've been at the forefront of the efforts on behalf of marriage equality, immigrant rights, housing, homelessness, racial justice. So we're able to do the sort of large impact kinds of cases and causes and advocacy that affect our communities at large, and also the kinds of cases and representation that help people one-on-one live a better life.
That's all?
Yeah. Yeah.
So let me
it's
go
the
back
brokenness
a
of
bit.
the world that we try to heal.
Let me go back a little bit to maybe help create a little context also. So, because I think before we met, it never occurred to me that your job even would exist, right? I obviously knew that there were pro bono legal aid organizations in the world that do remarkable work and use volunteers from large firms, but the idea of someone being at a firm whose full-time job it is to make sure that this kind of work is happening, within the walls, is that unique? How many counterparts do you have at other, large multinational firms?
Well, I ran Beit Tzedek from 1994 for close to a decade, so into the early 2000s. And when I was doing that, and we had a very large pro bono component to our delivery of services. We used hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of volunteers every year. There was nobody at a law firm like me, certainly not in Los Angeles, not even in California, not even on the West Coast. There were a handful of people doing this at major law firms on the East Coast, but there were very few. So there was really no point of contact for me when I was at Beit Tzedek to call these law firms and say, hey, you're the pro bono person. I've got these great cases. I had to develop relations throughout the law firms with various people who I would meet or speak to. I would give presentations and I try and get people interested. There was no person like me at any of these law firms from whom I was soliciting pro bono help. Over the years, so when I got hired at O'Melveny to do this job, I was the only one on the West Coast. And a couple years after I started, again, there were people on the East Coast doing this. There were a fair number by that point. We formed an organization called the Association of Pro Bono Counsel, which is people like me at big firms all over the country who, as full-time lawyers, are running their firms' pro bono programs. And when we started that organization, again, I was the only one on the West Coast. There were maybe 40 people in the organization when we started it. Today, there's over 250 from over 120 law firms around the country. It has become, in the world of big law firms, part of the business fabric of those law firms. It's part, if you don't have a robust pro bono program being run by a pro bono professional, you're a step behind the times these days. It's important for recruiting, and it's vital for recruiting, and it's vital for training, and it's vital for firm culture. And it's vital for the communities in which the law firms are working and trying to be a part of and be a good citizen in. So it's really grown. I mean, it's still a tiny corner of the legal community, but it has blossomed.
It's on the map now, certainly, it sounds like, compared to where it was when you started, right? And if I'm remembering another early conversation we had correctly, when you started, and you left this out of the story, when you started, this was not your full-time job. This was a sliver of your time spent, and that has grown over the years.
Yeah. Yeah, when I started, when I was leaving Beit Tzedek, O'Melveny asked me to come and join the firm and resume my previous career as a business and real estate litigator. And they also asked me to help them ramp up their pro bono program. And I knew from my days running Beit Tzedek that it was my job to know what every law firm's pro bono policies and practices were. And I knew that O'Melveny had a very deep, long history and tradition of doing pro bono work. So to be able to help them ramp up was a great opportunity for me. And for about 2 years or so, maybe a little more, I was only spending maybe 10 or 15% of my time ramping up the pro bono program. But in those couple years, with that amount of my time, the firm's pro bono hours doubled. And they asked me ultimately if I wanted to sort of switch my percentages. And I said, I could do a lot of damage if you asked me to do that. And they were, really supportive and great. And so it ultimately became my full-time position.
So I'm imagining, we're thinking about folks who need attorneys to help the world be a little fairer and more equal for them. And as has become a theme, I think, in these conversations, a pandemic or any crisis such as the one that we're all living through tends to, I think, disproportionately affect the folks who are already on the margins and already, underserved in so many ways. So, other than the fact that you're sitting in your dining room at home as opposed to, in your office downtown, how has this, alternate normal, I'm not ready to say new normal, that we're all living through, how has this pandemic affected, your work, but also maybe more broadly, pro bono work? Are the lawyers have more time to volunteer because they're not working 80 hours a week? Is there more need because of, folks trying to access stimulus money and all sorts of things? Like, how has this changed the landscape in the last 4 months?
Well, it's changed it a lot. I mean, first of all, we're not in our offices. We're trying to create new ways of reaching people and providing services, doing it remotely. And that's a big challenge, particularly for low-income people who may not have access to Zoom or computers. They can't even go to the library, which was very frequently their access point to the digital world. And even people with phones, we're finding that a lot of them don't have access right now to recharge their phones. So it's changed a lot of the dynamics. Whenever some big disaster or catastrophe hits, you're absolutely right. I mean, rabbis see it as much as lawyers see it, that the poor, the disenfranchised are disproportionately impacted. And this is no exception. Lawyers are generally not first responders so much in times of crisis. It's usually doctors and nurses and firefighters and rescue teams. And the lawyers generally come in a little bit later. The thing that the legal community is most cognizant of when these disasters strike is that we may not be there on day one. We may not be needed on day one or day two, but we're going to be needed in the long term. Sorry, working at home. We're going to be needed in the long term. We need to make a commitment to be there for the duration. So what happens is, and what has happened now during this pandemic, is there are all sorts of new needs arising. All sorts of people need legal help, many of whom never envisioned that they would need free legal help. So we have to respond. And, yes, in some pockets of our firm, there is some excess capacity. And so more people can step up. In other pockets of the firm, they're busier than ever. So that impacts what we can do. But the silver lining to all of these disasters is that people really want to help and people really step up. And even the busy lawyers step up and they just make extra time because it's so important. They want to help, they want to be productive, and they recognize, again, that they can do things nobody else can do to help. It's not like, we can solve everybody's problems, and it's not like we're, riding in on our horses to save the world, but there are aspects of recovery and assistance that only we can provide. And lawyers recognize that and they step up, and it's really inspiring, frankly. And there's all sorts of new needs and new clients.
Right. So that's my next question. So they're stepping up, they're creating more time and wanting to do something to help. Are they doing things that are similar to what they might have done 6 months ago, or are there new areas, new opportunities and avenues to try to specifically address some of the people's some of the consequences of this crisis?
Well, it's both. The problems of the poor are only exacerbated by what's going on, but there's also new problems that arise. We have seen a crush of small business owners seek free legal help that we never saw before, not like this. So many businesses are in such trouble that they need as much help as possible. And the new there's new ways to help too. The CARES Act, the Payroll Protection Plan. People need help navigating those new things. So our lawyers have to, on the fly, learn about those new avenues of help and be ready to offer assistance. And they're offering it to people who never thought that they would need that kind of help. You know, they had decent to good to great small businesses running, and they suddenly find themselves without income. And so it's a whole new community of pro bono clients. And, you know, there's a lot of people, we've seen, for instance, a huge number of people access legal aid and pro bono help who were in the entertainment industry. They were, you know, steadily employed for their whole careers. And all of a sudden, there's no more work. And people who never in a million years would have dreamed that they need free legal help are coming in very large numbers. They need unemployment assistance, you know, help with their leases and their contracts and their obligations that are brand new problems for them.
So new problems for them, and yeah, it sounds like creates a whole new pool of, unfortunately, potential clients.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what are sort of the, you know, big projects, big things, you know, that you've been working on, either connected to this or not necessarily, but.
Well, as I said, the small business assistance has been really important. The mayor and the city attorney launched a program called LA Represents in conjunction with a lot of the legal aid organizations and a lot of the firms to really be able to respond to all these new and growing needs, particularly small business needs. So we've been doing a lot of that. You know, as you said, it's disaffected communities that are most disproportionately impacted by all this. After the murder of Mr. Floyd, you know, that it came to the forefront. We already knew that the pandemic was impacting communities of color in a very disproportionate way. The murder of Mr. Floyd has accentuated the need and the awareness of lawyers being able to work in the racial justice field. You know, we're getting very involved with excessive force cases, and a lot of the a big impact from the pandemic has been, for instance, a number of state governors have used the pandemic to scale back and restrict access to reproductive rights. So we've been very involved in that, very involved in voting rights issues as a result of the pandemic, which also disproportionately impacts voters and communities of color. You know, restricting efforts to restrict voting by mail has a bigger impact on low-income communities and Black and brown communities, where there's already been evidence of voter suppression in terms of there being just fewer places to go and vote. So voting by mail becomes all the more important. And as that gets restricted more and more, becomes not only an issue driven by the pandemic, but by issues of race equity. So we've been, you know, very busy with all of these kinds of things.
I want to go back to something you mentioned, just because it was a little bit of new news to me. And obviously I know, you know, you're not necessarily the expert, but take me back to the idea of governors using the pandemic as a means to curtail existing reproductive rights.
A couple of governors have announced that because of the stay-at-home orders and the danger from entering into public buildings, that abortion clinics and Planned Parenthood offices are dangerous and their activities need to be restricted. That hospitals have to be reserved for treating those with COVID-19, and so any other services have to be halted, including reproductive services, even though those are services that can't wait until the pandemic is over. So we have been challenging those kinds of restricted pronouncements.
Which makes me think, sort of a related question, which is, one's own personal political opinions aside, how does politics and partisanship figure into the work you do?
That's an interesting question. We try to not let it figure in. We try, as do most firms, to not have a political litmus test on our pro bono work.
Because I imagine in without going into a whole other rabbit hole, but a conversation we've had many times, in a very similar way to a place like, let's say, Wilshire Boulevard Temple, which is a heterogeneous community of people from a political standpoint, certainly, right? And with people on all sides of every issue. I imagine a large law firm is actually very much the same, in which I'm sure there are, partners on all sides of political issues and candidates and all sorts of things. And yeah, at what point is there the appearance, whether it's true or not, of the firm sort of taking a side on an issue because of a pro bono case?
Yes, we have a very big tent, and underneath that tent are a lot of people with a lot of different political persuasions. O'Melveny is, we are the law firm of Warren Christopher, who was the chair of our firm for many, many years, and served as Jimmy Carter's Secretary of State. So he was very identified with that kind of political creed. So we do have something of a profile, but we have plenty of people. One of our chairs was Ronald Reagan's chief counsel. So we run the gamut, and we try to be as respectful as possible to that gamut. And sometimes it's sort of a race to whoever brings in a case first as to which side of an issue we may be on, because we really try not to have a litmus test. Most of the pro bono work we do is just combating poverty, and that's not a political issue by and large. So most of what we do is not controversial. It's helping people in need. But yes, same-sex marriage, reproductive rights, immigration, these have become very hot button political issues. And we have not had very much dissent, or mostly it's been very respectful. The only time I ever saw at our firm some sort of political filter was involving the rights of LGBTQ residents of our community, because we have LGBTQ members of our firm whose lives would be impacted very directly, and the life of our firm and culture of our firm would be impacted very directly by cases impacting their lives. So that was, we were asked at one point to do a case that would have, we felt, adversely impacted the lives of those members of our law firm community, and we declined. That was the only time I ever saw a political litmus test applied.
It's interesting. That's impressive to hear. And I wonder, if some of that is in a way baked into the nature of being a lawyer, right? Because I think about the fact that as a lawyer, you may pick clients and choose clients, but you frequently, I imagine, represent folks who you may or may not agree with, right? But you have a responsibility to represent them, to defend someone who may or may not be guilty of a crime, to negotiate a real estate transaction that, you may have your own opinions about. So the idea that the law sort of comes before one's own opinion might make that easier.
Yeah, it is. Look, we've taken cases in the pro bono realm that would be considered to be quite politically conservative. Not as often as we take the other side of the political spectrum, but we do. We've got a big tent, so we have done that. But as I said, most cases in the pro bono side of the firm are pretty non-controversial. Even immigration cases. One of the things, I really don't mean to get political here, but I'll just tell you a little story. When she was the Attorney General, Kamala Harris called a meeting as this crisis was developing at the border over unaccompanied children coming into the United States. And she called a meeting of the legal aid community and the pro bono community, and her pitch, which is very similar to the pitch our law firm makes, was these are children. I don't care what your political beliefs are, but right now under the law, these children, whether you like it or not, many of them have a right to be here and their safety is at stake. And under the law, they can seek that safety here. You don't like the law? I get it. Go change it. Work your butt off to change it. But right now, under the law, these kids have the right to seek safety here. And we're lawyers and we follow the law. And what we want you to do is to help these children access their legal rights. We do that a lot at the law firm. This is the law. And our job as lawyers is to make sure it works. That law works for the people that need it.
Whether you agree with the law or not, you're not, right? That's the benefit in some ways of the judiciary, right? It's not they enforce the law and interpret it, but don't create it.
Absolutely, right.
It's interesting. My uncle, who is a now mostly retired attorney in Boston, but in his early career was a criminal defense attorney. And I remember him talking about, it wasn't even a question to him. And he could care less whether someone, committed whatever crime they're accused of. Him just saying, look, they're entitled to a defense and that's the law. And my job is to make sure that the system works in the way it should and that a prosecutor has to prove their case, beyond a reasonable doubt. So enforcing the law, whether one agrees with it or not, I think is a powerful kind of way to think about the issue. So you said at the very beginning that, I promise you wouldn't tell anyone that you thought you have the greatest law firm job in town. What's the hardest part of your job?
Well, when I was at Beit Tzedek, I was first asked that question, and I do get asked it in this job as well. And I used to get made fun of because of my answer, because it was pretty trite, but it's pretty true. The hardest part of the job is saying no to people. People need this help. And when we don't have the capacity or we don't have the expertise or they just have a crappy case and that's not the best use of our resources, it's really hard to say no to people who are hurting.
It may be trite, but it is, as you said, true. And I imagine difficult.
It is. you know, when you do this kind of work, you see every day the brokenness of the world. And as Jews and as lawyers, we try to heal that brokenness. And when we can't, it's really hard. It really is. You know, one of the other things about this job is that people think that the folks that do this kind of work are selfless and, you know, generous. In truth, we get as much out of it as anybody does. In truth, it's kind of selfish as opposed to selfless, because it makes us feel good. And we're proud of what we do. So when we can't do it, it's really painful. There's a lot of people that need this help, and a lot of opportunities for us to help where we can't. And it hurts those people and it hurts us.
Well, the thoughtfulness and the eloquence in your answer reminds me of the piece that I left out of your introduction because it's irrelevant, but it matters to me, which is that David is one of the Temple's finest and member of the Temple family for what, 25 years, something like that?
Something like that, yeah.
Right. And really is the reason that we have a pro bono legal service program at the Carr Center, because of countless hours and time and thought that David put into to make that happen.
Well,
and continues to.
That's very generous of you, but you are the one who made it happen. I provided some background and experience,
some knowledge,
expertise. Yeah. But you and Rabbi Leader, it was your vision. You guys it was your vision, and then you made it happen.
I'll agree with you that it was a group effort. How's that? I see already a question in our chat from Merle that I'm gonna feed to you, David, and anybody else has questions, you know, chat, a digital hand raise, a real hand raise. But Merle wants to know, which you sort of answered, right? But I think there's a nuance to it also. She said, is there ever a situation in which you want to help, but there's nothing you can do, or that there's not actually an answer, a solution for someone?
Yes, yeah, sure. That happens a lot. Somebody, you know, may be facing homelessness and there's nothing we can do. They can't pay their rent, and it's sad, it's tragic, but we really can't help. Sometimes people present issues to us for which they need assistance that's really important to them that we just don't have the expertise to handle either. And we just can't help. And sometimes somebody may have a great case that's important, that's meritorious, that we have the expertise to do, but we just may not have the resources at that moment in time.
So that makes me think of, and I'm asking this based on other conversations that we've had, how much of the cases that sort of fall into those buckets are family law cases?
That's one of the great problems in our community today, is that probably the single greatest undermet need for people in our community who are low income is family law assistance. We at our firm, in all the years I've been there, we've had one partner who had a lot of family law experience. And so we were only able to take whatever cases he had the capacity to work on, because we just did not have the expertise to do that. And when he left the firm just a number of months ago, you know, we had to shut that down. It's really a huge need in the low income community, and most big law firms don't have that kind of practice and that kind of expertise, and can only provide very limited help. and it's a huge problem. When you walk into the family law court in the LA Superior Court, I don't know the statistics, but it wouldn't surprise me if 90% of the people who are parties in the family law cases are unrepresented.
Mm.
Terrible problem.
Well,
Maggie. Maggie's raising her hand. Like
I'm gonna cut Maggie
time.
off and have her sit on her question because Lori already threw one in the chat. Sit on your question. So Lori wants to know, how do you take care of yourself and recharge yourself when the work's overwhelming, you have to say no too many times, or some of the cases that you said are sad and heart-wrenching.
They are, and that's a question and an issue that me and my colleagues around the country in both legal aid organizations and pro bono positions that we grapple with, and we have each other. I mentioned the Association of Pro Bono Counsel. It's an incredible network of support and education and assistance and referrals, and we are in touch with each other every day. The 200 of us. And part of it is for that reason, that we know what we're going through, and to be able to talk to people who are going through it as well at the same time is very important and very helpful. The other thing is that with all the work we do, we have some incredible, inspiring victories. I'll just quickly give you one that arose during the pandemic. Right at the outset of the pandemic, right when the stay-at-home orders hit, without getting into it a lot, there is a whole new wave of family separation at the US-Mexico border that's going on. And we, along with a couple of legal aid organizations, took on a case on behalf of 3 children who were separated from their parents at the border, and they were held in detention, and their mother was still at the border. Their father ultimately made it into the United States, but the kids were being held in detention, and they were not allowed to be reunited with their father, who had arrived properly in the United States. And we took on that case. And it happened, as I said, right when the stay-at-home orders began, and everything, we were trying to figure out how to do this all remotely, and we were having court hearings, and the judge was at home, and the law clerks were at home, and we were at home, and how do you file documents, and how do you edit documents among the group of co-counsel, and we were learning and struggling every day, and when we succeeded in getting those kids released from detention and reunited with their father, it was so inspiring. It was on Zoom that we got to watch it, but everybody was in tears and applauding and stomping their feet. It felt so good to accomplish that. That really helps the mental aspect of all of this.
I bet. Maggie.
So kind of going back, David, to something you were talking about earlier, do you, with all these big issue things, excessive force cases, and of which there are many, and the access to voting rights, access to healthcare, are you led by people who come to you, or are you leading by saying, this is an area we really need to get involved in, let's find a way to support other public counsel, ACLU, whoever else are out there doing it in the nonprofit world? How does that come about in terms of the broad issues?
It happens both ways. After all these years, I and the firm have great relationships with the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center and the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, and they will frequently call us when they have a big case that they would like us to co-counsel with them on. And You know, after Mr. Floyd was murdered, we did a lot of outreach to organizations saying, look, we know this is going to be a fraught moment. How can we help? So it goes both ways. So we get cases all sorts of different ways, and it's all a matter of building relationships. I mean, it's like in any other business or like the commercial side of the firm. It's all about building relationships and being able to call on those relationships when they're most needed. So we try to do it as thoroughly as we can. And so it comes in both directions.
Anybody else? Yeah, Gail. Let me unmute you, Gail. Can you unmute yourself?
There we go.
There we go.
Okay. I'm thinking about the 90% of the cases in the family law court. And I'm wondering, this is an oversimplified way to ask the question, but why doesn't somebody do something about this? Is it just too overwhelming? Because there's so many people of all ages being affected going forward for the rest of their life by what goes on.
Yeah, it's tragic. There's something that we in the legal community refer to as the justice gap, which is what it sounds like. It's the gap between the need for lawyers and the availability of lawyers. And for people of low income, the gap, the justice gap, is generally estimated at about 80%. That means 80% of the people that need a lawyer can't get one. And I think it's worse in the family law arena, but it's a larger problem than just family law. There are, just a quick, very unscientific story.
Sorry about the phone.
There's a wonderful professor at UCLA Law School, he's now retired, who at one point enlisted a whole bunch of volunteers to track 150 cases in the housing court where the tenant did not have a lawyer. And we tracked those 150 cases, and the tenant, who was unrepresented, lost out of that 150 cases 150 times. At the same time, places like Beit Tzedek were winning or getting favorable results for 90% of their clients who had housing issues. That means that this justice gap is creating a huge percentage of our homeless problem, a huge percentage of people that don't have access to health care is because of this justice gap. And the women and the children in particular who need the protection of the family court, they're not getting that either. So it's a huge problem. There are initiatives called Right to Counsel, or sometimes we refer to it as Civil Gideon, because the Gideon case from the Supreme Court several decades ago requires that every criminal defendant have a lawyer. Civil Gideon is a movement to be sure that every person who is facing the loss of basic necessities of life also has access to a lawyer, on the theory that losing those basic necessities is somewhat equivalent to losing freedom. So it's a huge problem. It's a big societal problem that really needs to be addressed.
It's so funny, David. The issue is not funny, but funny that you just mentioned the Gideon case, because I'm sitting at home in my study at home and staring just beyond my computer at a bookshelf that has sort of the remnants of, books from college that have little to do with anything. But one of them is Tony Lewis's book, Gideon's Trumpet, about that case that I had to read for some, like, I don't know, undergraduate pseudo pre-law class or something that I was taking. And it just caught my eye at the exact moment that you,
Yeah.
that you shared that.
That was a great book. It was a great book.
Let's see, Michael has to leave. Okay. The last thing I'll say just about, and this is not why I asked the question, but it is something that this whole kind of gap in the family law space is something that, you know, David and I are trying to cook up an idea or two to see if we can address at and through Karsh, you know, in the coming years.
Yeah.
Hopefully. And I think I'll let David, you know, give a real answer. Maggie asks in the chat, is it just not lucrative enough? I'm sure a big piece of it's a money issue. I'm sure there's a liability issue. And just from what you've also shared with me on other occasions, it being incredibly difficult for a number of reasons to get an attorney who's not a family law attorney to volunteer to take a family law case.
Yeah, that's almost impossible. Yeah. It's just too specialized practice to kind of dabble in. And
which is not necessarily the case with other aspects of pro bono
Right.
work. I'm just thinking about
Right.
many of the clinics we've done, you know, lots of transactional attorneys around the temple, right, who are more than happy to take even a criminal expungement case or an immigration case or, you know,
yeah,
wills and
These
directives.
are focused enough, and a lawyer can learn enough and apply already well-honed skills to that they can do the work. Family law is so specialized, it's got its own court, its own statutes, its own practices, its own rules and regulations, and a lot of them are very complicated, that lawyers are very reluctant to venture that far outside their comfort zones. So it's hard, it's really hard to get a non-family law lawyer to do that. Now, we do some aspects of it. Lawyers will do domestic violence temporary restraining orders, because getting a temporary restraining order is akin to what skills and experience they likely have, or doing a simple adoption. That's pretty easy. But, you know, a contested divorce with pension issues and child custody issues, there's way too much at stake to be able to dabble in it. You know, one time I made the pitch to our firm that any lawyer is better than no lawyer. And somebody said to me, you know, if the chair of our biggest corporate client insisted that we do his or her divorce, we would say, no, we don't have the expertise to do that. We cannot help you. It would be malpractice for us to do that. Why would we set a different standard for somebody who's poor?
Oof.
It's a tough issue, because I do think any lawyer is better than no lawyer, but he's right. You know, if I'm not capable of doing a competent job for somebody, I'm doing a disservice to them, to me, to the system, to the profession, to the community.
So Maggie asks, is it that young lawyers aren't going into family law?
It's I don't know the answer to that. It's a tough area to break into. There's a tough area to attract people to get into. I'm not sure why, but it's a tough area. It's very emotional. It's unlike anything else we do. So it's hard.
Well, on that incredibly cheerful note.
But well, to end on a cheerful note,
Yeah.
I will go back to my first point, which is that the legal community really steps up, and it's inspiring, and what they do is so important. You know, not to denigrate any other way to do charity. There are so many important ways for people to help other people and to help our community. But again, there's what lawyers can do, only lawyers can do. And it's really inspiring to see.
Well, David, thank you. Thank you for being so generous with your time this morning, and for dedicating, as I said at the beginning, your professional life and your powers, to help folks that need it so much.
Well, thanks for having me. Always great to see you, and all of you. Thanks for your questions, and thanks for your interest.
All right, everybody. We'll see
Thank
you
you
next
so
week, everybody.
much.